Book 2, Part 2 of The Art of War by Machiavelli, translated by Henry Neville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Book 2, Part 2. As to the teaching of the use of arms, they were trained in this way. They had the young men put on arms and armour which weighed more than twice that of the real ones, and as a sword they gave them a leaded club, which in comparison was very heavy. They made each one of them drive a pole into the ground, so that 3 arm lengths remained above ground, and so firmly fixed that blows would not drive it to one side or have it fall to the ground. Against this pole the young men were trained with the shield and the club, as against an enemy. And sometimes they went at it as if they wanted to wound the head or the face, another time as if they wanted to puncture the flank, sometimes the legs, sometimes they drew back, another time they went forward. And in this training they had in mind making themselves adept at covering themselves and wounding the enemy. And since the feigned arms were very heavy, the real ones afterward seemed light. The Romans wanted their soldiers to wound the enemy by the driving of a point against him, rather than by cutting or slashing, as much because such a blow was more fatal and had less defence against it, as also because it left less uncovered those who were wounding, making him more adept at repeating his attack than by slashing. Do you not wonder that those ancients should think of these minute details? For they reasoned that where men had to come hand to hand in battle, every little advantage is of the greatest importance. And I will remind you of that, because the writers say of this that I have taught it to you. Nor did the ancients esteem it a more fortunate thing in a republic than to have many of its men trained in arms. For it is not the splendour of jewels and gold that makes the enemy submit themselves to you, but only fear of arms. Moreover, errors made in other things can sometimes be corrected afterwards, but those that are made in war, as the punishment happens immediately, cannot be corrected. In addition to this, knowing how to fight makes men more audacious, as no one fears to do the things which appear to him he has been taught to do. The ancients, therefore, wanted their citizens to train in every warlike activity, and even had them throw darts against the pole, heavier than the actual ones, which exercise, in addition to making men expert in throwing, also makes the arms more limber and stronger. They also taught them how to draw the bow and the sling, and placed teachers in charge of doing all these things, so that when men were selected to go to war, they were already soldiers in spirit and disposition. Nor did these remain to teach them anything else than to go by the orders and maintain themselves in them when marching or combating, which they easily taught by mixing themselves with them, so that by knowing how to keep orders, they could exist longer in the army. Cosimo said, "Would you have them train this way now?" Fabrizio said, "Many of those which have been mentioned, like running, wrestling, making them jump, making them work hard under arms heavier than the ordinary, making them draw the crossbow and the sling, to which I would add the light gun, a new instrument, as you know, and a necessary one. And I would accustom all of the youth of my state to this training. But that part of them whom I have enrolled to fight, I would especially train with greater industry and more solicitude, and I would train them always on their free days. I would also desire that they be taught to swim, which is a very useful thing, because there are not always bridges at rivers, nor ships ready, so that if your army does not know how to swim, it may be deprived of many advantages, and many opportunities to act well are taken away. The Romans, therefore, arranged that the young men be trained on the field of Mars, so that having the river Tiber nearby, they would be able, after working hard in exercise on land, to refresh themselves in the water, and also exercise them in their swimming. I would also do as the ancients, and train those who fight on horseback, which is very necessary, for in addition to knowing how to ride, they would know how to avail themselves of the horse in manoeuvring him. And therefore they arranged horses of wood, on which they straddled and jumped over them armed and unarmed, without any help and without using their hands, which made it possible that in a moment, and at a sign from the captain, the cavalry to become as foot soldiers, and also at another sign for them to be remounted. And as such exercises, both on foot and horseback, were easy at that time, so now it should not be difficult for that republic or that prince to put them in practice on their youth, as is seen from the experience of Western cities, where these methods similar to these institutions are yet kept alive. They divide all their inhabitants into several parts, and assign one kind of arms of those they use in war to each part. And as they used pikes, halberds, bows, and light guns, they called them pikemen, halberdiers, archers, and gunners. It therefore behooved all the inhabitants to declare in what order they wanted to be enrolled. And as all, whether because of age or other impediment, are not fit for war, they make a selection from each order, and call them the jurati, sworn ones, who on their free days are obliged to exercise themselves in those arms in which they are enrolled. And each one is assigned his place by the public where such exercises are to be carried on, and those who are of that order but are not sworn participate by contributing money for those expenses which are necessary for such exercises. That which they do, therefore, we can do, but our little prudence does not allow us to take up any good proceeding. From these exercises it resulted that the ancients had good infantry, and that now those of the West have better infantry than ours. For the ancients exercised either at home, as did those republics, or in the armies, as did those emperors, for the reasons mentioned above. But we do not want to exercise at home, and we cannot do so in the field, because they are not our subjects, and we cannot obligate them to other exercises than they themselves want. This reason has caused the armies to die out first, and then the institutions, so that the kingdoms and the republics, especially the Italian, exist in such a weak condition today. But let us return to our subject, and pursuing this matter of training, I say that it is not enough in undertaking good training to have hardened the men, make them strong, fast, and dexterous, but it is also necessary to teach them to keep discipline, obey the signs, the sounds of the bugle and the voice of the captain, to know when to stand, to retire, to go forward, and when to combat, to march, to maintain ranks. For without this discipline, despite every careful diligence observed and practiced, an army is never good. And without doubt, bold but undisciplined men are more weak than the timid but disciplined ones. For discipline drives away fear from men. Lack of discipline makes the bold act foolishly. And so that you may better understand what will be mentioned below, you have to know that every nation has made its men train in the discipline of war, or rather its army as the principal part, which, if they have varied in name, they have varied little in the numbers of men involved, as all have comprised 6,000 to 8,000 men. This number was called a legion by the Romans, a phalanx by the Greeks, a caterna by the Gauls. This same number by the Swiss, who alone retain any of that ancient military umbrage, in our times is called in their language what ours signifies a battalion. It is true that each one is further subdivided into small battalia, companies, and organized according to its purpose. It appears to me, therefore, more suitable to base our talk on this more notable name, and then according to the ancient and modern systems, arrange them as best as is possible. And as the Roman legions were composed of 5,000 or 6,000 men in 10 cohorts, I want to divide our battalion into 10 companies, and to compose it of 6,000 men on foot, and assign 450 to each company, of whom 400 are heavily armed, and 50 lightly armed. The heavily armed include 300 with shields and swords, and will be called scudati, shield bearers, and 100 with pikes, and will be called pikemen. The lightly armed are 50 infantry armed with light guns, crossbows, halberds and bucklers, and these, from an ancient time, are called regular, ordinary veliti. The whole 10 companies, therefore, come to 3,000 shield-bearers, 1,000 ordinary pikemen, and 150 ordinary veliti, all of whom comprise a number of 4,500 infantry. And we said we wanted to make a battalion of 6,000 men. Therefore, it is necessary to add another 1,500 infantry, of whom I would make 1,000 with pikes, whom I will call extraordinary pikemen, and 500 lightly armed, whom I will call extraordinary veliti. And thus my infantry would come, according as we said a little while ago, to be composed half of shield-bearers, and half among pikemen and other arms. In every company I would put in charge a constable, 4 centurions, and 40 heads of 10, and in addition a head of the ordinary veliti with 5 heads of 10. To the 1,000 extraordinary pikemen I would assign 3 constables, 10 centurions, and 100 heads of 10. To the extraordinary veliti, 2 constables, 5 centurions, and 50 heads of 10. I would also assign a general head for the whole battalion. I would want each constable to have a distinct flag and bugle sound. Summarizing, therefore, a battalion will be composed of 10 companies, of 3,000 shield-bearers, 1,000 ordinary pikemen, 1,000 extraordinary pikemen, 500 ordinary veliti, and 500 extraordinary veliti. Thus there would come to be 6,000 infantry, among whom there would be 1,500 heads of 10, and in addition 15 constables with 15 buglers and 15 flags, 55 centurions, 10 captains of ordinary veliti, and 1 captain for the whole battalion with its flag and bugler. And I have knowingly repeated this arrangement many times, so that then, when I show you the methods for organizing the companies and the armies, you will not be confounded. I say, therefore, that any king or republic which would want to organize its subjects in arms would provide them with these parties and these arms, and create as many battalions in the country as it is capable of doing. And if it had organized it according to the divisions mentioned above, and wanting to train it according to the orders, they need only to be trained company by company. And although the number of men in each of them could not by themselves provide a reasonably sized army, nonetheless each man can learn to do what applies to him in particular. For 2 orders are observed in the armies: the one, what men ought to do in each company; the other, what the company ought to do afterwards when it is with others in an army. And those men who carry out the first will easily observe the second, but without the first one can never arrive at the discipline of the second. Each of these companies, therefore, can by themselves learn to maintain discipline in their ranks, in every kind of place and action, and then to know how to assemble, to know its particular bugle call through which it is commanded in battle, to know how to recognize by it, as galleys do from the whistle, as to what they have to do, whether to stay put or go forward or turn back, or the time and place to use their arms, so that knowing how to maintain ranks well, so that neither the action nor the place disorganizes them, they understand well the commands of the leader by means of the bugle calls, and knowing how to reassemble quickly, these companies then can easily, when many have come together, learn to do what each body of them is obligated to do together with other companies in operating as a reasonably sized army. And as such a general practice also is not to be esteemed little, all the battalions can be brought together once or twice in the years of peace, and give them a form of a complete army, training it for several days as if it should engage in battle, placing the front lines, the flanks, and auxiliaries in their proper places. And as a captain arranges his army for the engagement, either taking into account the enemy he sees, or for that which he does not see but is apprehensive of, the army ought to be trained for both contingencies, and instructed so that it can march and fight when the need arises. showing your soldiers how they should conduct themselves if they should be assaulted by this band or that. And when you instruct them to fight against an army they can see, show them how the battle is enkindled, where they have to retire without being repulsed, who has to take their places, what signs or bugle calls, and what voice they should obey, and to practice them so with the companies and by mock battles that they have the desire for real battle. For a courageous army is not so because the men in it are courageous, but because the ranks are well disciplined. For if I am of the first-line fighters, and being overcome, I know where I have to retire, and who is to take my place, I will always fight with courage, seeing my succour nearby. If I am of the second-line fighters, I would not be dismayed at the first line being pushed back and repulsed, for I would have presupposed it could happen, and I would have desired it in order to be he who, as it was not them, would give the victory to my patron. Such training is most necessary when a new army is created, and where the army is old, it is also necessary, for as the Romans show, although they knew the organization of their army from childhood, nonetheless, those captains, before they came to an encounter with the enemy, continually exercised them in those disciplines. And Joseph, in his history, says that the continual training of the Roman armies resulted in all the disturbances which usually goes on for gain in a camp, was of no effect in an engagement, because everyone knew how to obey orders and to fight by observing them. But in the armies of new men which you have put together to combat at the time, or that you have caused to be organized to combat in time, nothing is done without this training, as the companies are different as in a complete army. For as much discipline is necessary, it must be taught with double the industry and effort to those who do not have it, and be maintained in those who have it, as is seen from the fact that many excellent captains have tired themselves without any regard to themselves. Cosimo said, "And it appears to me that this discussion has somewhat carried you away, for while you have not yet mentioned the means with which companies are trained, you have discussed engagements and the complete army." Fabrizio said, "You say the truth, and truly the reason is the affection I have for these orders, and the sorrow that I feel that they are not put into action. Nonetheless, have no fear, I shall return to the subject. As I have told you, of first importance in the training of the company is to know how to maintain ranks. To do this, it is necessary to exercise them in those orders which they called ciocchioli, or spiraling. And as I told you that one of these companies ought to consist of 400 heavily armed infantry, I will stand on this number. They should, therefore, be arranged into 80 ranks or files, with 5 per file. Then continuing on either strongly or slowly, grouping them and dispersing them, which, when it is done, can be demonstrated better by deeds than by words. Afterwards, it becomes less necessary, for anyone who is practiced in these exercises knows how this order proceeds, which is good for nothing else but to accustom the soldiers to maintain ranks. But let us come and put together one of these companies. I say that these can be formed in 3 ways. The first and most useful is to make it completely massive and give it the form of 2 squares. The second is to make the square with a home front. The third is to make it with a space in the center, which they call piazza. The method of putting together the first form can be in 2 steps. The first is to have the files doubled, that is, the second file enters the first, the fourth into the third, the 6th into the 5th, and so on in succession, so that where there were 80 files and 5 men per file, there become 40 files and 10 per file. Then make them double another time in the same manner, placing one file within the other, and thus they become 20 files of 20 men per file. This makes almost a square, for although there are so many on one side as on the other, nonetheless, on the side of the front, they come together so that the side of one man touches the next. But on the other side of the square, the men are distant at least 2 arms' length from each other, so that the square is longer from the front to the back or shoulders than from one side or flank to the other, so that the rectangle thus formed is called 2 squares. And as we have to talk often today of the parts in front, in the rear, and on the side of this company, and of the complete army, you will understand that when I will say either head or front, I mean to say the part in front. When I say shoulder, the part behind or rear. When I say flanks, the parts on the side. The 50 ordinary veliti of the company are not mixed in with the other files, but when the company is formed, they extend along its flanks. The other method of putting together or forming the company is this, and because it is better than the first, I want to place it in front of your eyes in detail how it ought to be organized. I believe you remember the number of men and the heads which compose it, and with what arms it is armed. The form, therefore, that this company ought to have is, as I have said, of 20 files, 20 men per file, 5 files of pikemen in front, and 15 files of shield-bearers on the shoulders behind. 2 centurions are in front, and 2 behind in the shoulders, who have the office of those whom the ancients called tergidatori, or rear leaders. The constable, with a flag and bugler, is in that space which is between the 5 files of pikemen and the 15 of shield-bearers. There is one of the captains of 10 on every flank, so that each one is alongside his men, those who are on the left side of his right hand, those on the right side of his left hand. The 50 veliti are on the flanks and shoulders of the company. If it is desired now that regular infantry be employed, this company is put together in this form, and it must organize itself thusly. Have the infantry be brought to 80 files, 5 per file, as we said a little while ago, leaving the veliti at the head and on the tail, even though they are outside this arrangement. And it ought to be so arranged that each centurion has 20 files behind him on the shoulders, and those immediately behind every centurion are 5 files of pikemen, and the remaining shield-bearers. The constable, with his flag and bugler, is in that space that is between the pikemen and the shield-bearers of the second centurion, and occupies the places of 3 shield-bearers. 20 of the heads of 10 are on the flanks of the first centurion on the left hand, and 20 are on the flanks of the last centurion on the right hand. And you have to understand that the head of 10 who has to guide the pikemen ought to have a pike, and those who guide the shield-bearers ought to have similar arms. The files, therefore, being brought to this arrangement, and if it is desired by marching to bring them into the company to form the head, you have to cause the first centurion to stop with the first file of 20, and the second to continue to march. And turning to the right, he goes along the flanks of the 20 stopped files, so that he comes head to head with the other centurion, where he too stops. And the third centurion continues to march, also turning to the right, and marches along the flanks of the stopped files, so that he comes head to head with the other 2 centurions. And when he also stops, the other centurion follows with his file, also going to the right along the flanks of the stopped file, so that he arrives at the head, front, with the others, and then he stops. And the 2 centurions who are alone quickly depart from the front and go to the rear of the company, which becomes formed in that manner and with those orders to the point which we showed a little while ago. And the veliti extend themselves along its flanks, according as they were disposed in the first method, which method is called doubling by the straight line, and this last method is called doubling by the flanks. The first method is easier, while this latter is better organized and is more adaptable and can be better controlled by you, for it must be carried out by the numbers, that from 5 you make 10, 10, 20, 20, 40. So that by doubling at your direction, you cannot make a front of 15 or 25 or 30 or 35, but you must proceed to where the number is less. And yet every day it happens in particular situations that you must make a front with 600 or 800 infantry, so that the doubling by the straight line will disarrange you, yet this latter method pleases me more, and what difficulty may exist can be more easily overcome by the proper exercise and practice of it. End of Book 2, Part 2.